We are now live.
We are now live. Where are you streaming it, attorney? So I can share it. Oh, here, I found it. Yeah, there you go. Copy link.
Share ko lang sa events. Okay, hello, hi. Just give us 1 minute. We're just sharing our screen here. Okay, hi, good evening, everyone. This is Nick Caracal here, live in New York. So we have a very good set of guest speakers here today. So before I do that, let me introduce my guests. We have our dear labor attaché, attorney Angela Trinidad from Washington, D.C. Paulo, hello, ma'am. Can you just quickly introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Attorney Nick. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Dr. Paul, good morning. Good evening.
Good evening, attorney Trinidad. Good evening, attorney Carkel.
And we also have Dr. Biluan here. He will be representing our nursing community or healthcare professionals community. So the topic is actually being entitled to say contract buyouts and more. As a matter of fact, in my weekly basis or in my daily practice, I always get a message or inquiry about hey whether or not I could actually accommodate contract reviews or actually interpret for them what buyout means and how it impacts immigration law. So finally, we will have that avenue today. So if you have some questions, just write them down in our section, comment section. Then we're gonna answer all of this question as much as we can. Okay, so this will be in a Q&A format. Dr. Biluan will actually facilitate our presentation today. And if during the presentation there will be differences of opinion between my legal views and attorney, it's okay. So lawyers are actually not expected to be in agreement in all topics or areas. So, but you could actually see the different perspective. As we hope that we have the same view, but if there's none, then it's okay as well. Okay. So then, just a quick disclaimer: whatever we discuss here today, do not take it as a personal, specific advice to you. No,
Mm-hmm.
but we will try to answer your general questions generally. But if you would want to discuss that in more detail, you could either send us an email message or messenger, and then we can talk about your case specifically. Okay. So I think we are ready now. I will just uh, walk you through as to the general format and topics that we're going to be discussing. So we actually partition it into four parts. We're going to talk about first the breach of contract and the buyout provisions. Then after that, we're going to talk about labor and human trafficking and how is it relevant for the nursing or the healthcare professionals. And then we'll talk other concerns. Doesn't necessarily fall under the first two topics. And then lastly, Attorney Trinidad here would introduce the role of the Philippine office, ano na Polo?
Philippine Overseas Labor Office.
Philippine Labor Office, and then
Labor office.
she would actually explain to you paano yung role nyo in the event that you will have concerns about the first three topics, no? Kasi their office is basically the office that could actually help us when we actually encounter problems like this. Okay, so wala namang problema, but then again, if there is, then that's the actually office that would basically give us help. Okay, so I think we are ready, Doc, to start.
Yes, sir. All right. And we have prepared quite a few questions today from our nursing community. So I'm representing the nursing community today. Thank you, Attorney Carkel and Attorney Trinidad, for joining us in the show today. And I've collected quite a few questions from the community, which we will be asking you today. And hopefully, we can get some advice and tips from you. All
Okay.
right. And let's see our first question. Attorney, can we share the slides, please?
Sorry, I have to share the screen.
Yes, sir.
Okay,
All
now we
right. The
can.
first question from the yes, sir. Attorney Kirkel and Attorney Trinidad. The first question that I got from nurses are is what should nurses look for and carefully scrutinize in an employment contract?
Okay. So, Attorney Trinidad, would you like to actually? I have some slides here, but you may share the same view, or but I'll give you the first floor to answer that question.
Thank you for that, Dr. Paul. And I think that is a very valid and basic question that our nurses should be asking, if and when they are asked to, or their services are secured, no, whether locally or overseas. Of course, in the contract of employment, the basic thing is that it must be an agreement of between the two parties. So, ibig sabihin, I think there is supposedly that idea that both parties agree to each and every term that is in the contract. It could be initially proposed by one party and agreed to by the other, pwedeng ganon, or they talk it among themselves, make their proposals, and after that, they reflect it in, I mean, they reduce it into writing. No? Yun yung ideal, no? But of course, we know that in contracts of employment, usually they're contracts of adhesion, no? Yung parang, of course, the employer is the one who always formulates the contract. And we do not fault the any preparer of the contract nor drafter to propose provisions that are, it's not skewed against the other party, or but definitely more favorable, to the party who prepares it. So that's expected, no? So yun yung basic principle ng contract sana, no? Agreement between two parties. Pero ang sabi ko nga, in the contract of employment, hindi gano'n, no? That's why I already segue to the Philippine government's role. That's why there are governments. So they're supposed to even out because in a contract of employment, usually it is the employer who drafts it, and it is the employer who usually has the bargaining power, no? So andun sa
Right.
kanya ang alas, no? So the government, and later on I will explain, is supposed to be there to make sure, no, that the interests of the other party, especially our workers, are reflected and protected. No? So I think nandito na sa nilagay din ni Attorney Caracal, no, in the slide, no, that of course in the contract of employment you have to look at the terms and conditions, both favorable or not. It should be there, the terms and conditions of employment. Second, from our perspective, the terms and conditions should be consistent with the laws of uh, parties, no? Pwedeng ang parties are in the same country, good. But if they are in the they belong to different countries, it must be consistent with the laws of both countries. So responsibilities, duties, as stated here, compensation and benefit. And then from our perspective too, as at least nandito kay Attorney Caraquel, the causes, there are mandatory provisions para sa amin, no? For the Philippine government. Una, we want to know what are the benefits, including transportation, saan ba siya papunta, sino bang magso-shoulder nito, at dapat hindi ang employee, no? It should be the employer. Pangalawa, ano yung mga social protection packages, ibig sabihin, as an example, insurance. So we are very concerned about mandatory insurance coverage for our workers. The third provision that is important to us is issue of termination. Now, we
Mhm.
want our workers to have security of tenure, of course, or any other worker, security of tenure. But this is qualified in the case of the United States because we have basically an at-will employment doctrine. But
Mhm.
of course, I think Attorney Caracal will also agree with me that this at-will employment doctrine has already been modified, long been modified. If there is a contract, ibig sabihin, may pag-uusap na even about when and how. So, yun na. And then the fourth one, in some cases, we look into the responsibilities of employers, specifically on repatriation. So it could apply, it could not apply to a particular worker in the United States. But since we are talking about nurses, itong repatriation is very tricky, no? Kasi of course, our nurses, when they come here, there is an expectation that they become permanent residents or probably take more a regular pathway than like citizenship, etc. So these are the things that basically, no, a nurse or a worker should look into and try to see whether these are present in their contracts of employment.
Right. And thank you for that, attorney, though. And I think good thing that you actually mentioned that while this presentation is specifically requested by the nurses, but ang pinag-uusapan kasi natin dito really applies for every contract. Eh. So, right. So, even if these are actually a contract of employment or job offer for teachers or other professionals or non-professionals, the concerns that we will be discussing apply to all, no? Kaya, ang napapansin lang natin is if there will be a job offer, especially from a US employer, everybody gets excited, no? So kumalma lang tayo muna and you really have to make sure that before you sign and send back that contract, na naintindihan mo yung pinipirmahan mo. Kasi ang kagaya sinabi ni attorney, once there is already a meeting of the mind and that's been indicated by you signing the contract, then it becomes valid.
Mhm.
No? That's where actually where the agreement of the parties comes in. Okay? So, meron na ako summary dito, but before I'll do that, marami kasi tayong naririnig, attorney, na ay pinagbabawalan kasi kaming i-share yung contract because of the confidentiality clause.
Right.
Laruin lang namin that the confidentiality clause actually prohibits you from sharing your contract to any other person or any other employer, but it doesn't prohibit you from asking a lawyer, even locally in the Philippines or local attorney, to review the contract for you. Kasi minsan, the terms may sound simple, but iba na pala yung
Meaning.
implications nun sa legality side, no?
Right.
In law practice, a may and a shall makes a big difference, no? So I know that consulting a lawyer in the Philippines might cost you some few $1,000s or 100 pesos, but I think it's worth an investment para before mo pirmahan yon, alam mo kung anong pinipirmahan mo. Okay? And I think I just like to summarize on that, no? Attorney Tinad already talks about the points here I raised, but I just want to re-emphasize kasi lalabas yon sa pag-uusap natin ng breach of contract, no? Kasi maraming nagko-consult sa amin. Nagrereklamo, sir, hindi naman itong duty and responsibility na inassign sa amin. Now, whether or not that constitute breach of contract, pag-usapan natin yon mamaya. Kasi ano bang nirereklamo ng mga nurses or other professionals in the US? Very common naman no? Hindi ito pinag-usapan namin ng trabaho ko. Hindi ito
Right.
pinag-usapan namin ng area of assignment ko. Right?
Right.
Ito yung pinag-usapang sweldo ko or benefits ko. Right? And then, when you start having that problem with the employer, then necessarily or willingly or unwillingly, it might lead you towards the conversation of i-terminate na ba tayo? Or tatanggalin na ba ako? And so on and so forth, right? So you have to really have that conversation. At kung nahihirapan kayo naintindihan yon, then consult a lawyer para mas mag-guide kayo before you sign that contract and get excited and send it back to the employer. No? Kasi pag sinign mo na yun, there's already an agreement of the parties. Ngayon, kung may mga damages and liabilities doon, it can be enforced. And it's on the option, it's discretionary doon sa employer mo whether or not they're gonna enforce that contract, no? Even if hindi
Right.
palipad. Okay? And then another important thing is the contract and the commitment periods, no? Kasi pag pinirmahan ng contract, ang normally nakikita mo dun sa taas ng kontrata, kung kailan effective yung kontratang pinirmahan mo, no? So generally it is 3 years na pinagbawalan kang maghanap ng agency or kumanggap ng trabaho and so on and so forth, but generally yung term ng kontrata na yon binds you in that period. So kung part ng usapan sa kontrata is bawal kang mag-engage ng another agency else there will be damages, then they could really enforce that, no? You have to understand that. Then iba, pag kinakausap na yung mga abogado, sila, hindi pa naman kami nag-start mag-work then you get confused between the effectivity dates of the contract and the commitment periods. This is when you are already
Mhm.
employee. No? In
Right, right.
US, na magsa-start ka, no? Normally pa nakakakalito, and Attorney Trinidad can very well add to this, is akala nila na pag dumating na sila sa US, there is this 1 month training period or 3 months training period, whether may sweldo sila or why, is basically a different conversation, depende kung ano nakasulat sa kontrata nila, and then nagre-reklamo na sila. Then, sabi natin, bakit hindi mo binasa yung contract mo in the first place? No?
Right.
Because this should have been clarified before you actually send that letter or contract. No?
Right.
And then, may sinasabi din si attorney kanina yung contract of adhesion. No? So, in that type of formats of contracts kasi, you are not really in the same level of negotiation position with the employer kasi nandiyan na yung kontrata eh. But during your communication or interview phase with the employer, I think it's okay to basically clarify some provisions of the contract. No? Kasi at the end of the day, kung hindi kayo magkaintindihan, doon pa lang sa phase na yon, considering that very in demand ang nursing profession, you have to take advantage of that reality eh. No? Na pag binigyan ka ng job offer, you don't have to sign that job offer immediately. Kasi baka bukas mayroon pang magbibigay ng job offer sa'yo. Then you can
Right.
compare saan ang mas favorable sa'yo na kontrata.
Yeah,
No?
I do have heard of some agencies forcing nurses to sign within 24 to 48 hours. That sense of urgency is already like a red flag, because why are you rushing someone to like really read into the contract and understand the
Right.
provisions of the
Right.
contract?
Okay. So basically, yun yung opinion namin, Doc. Anything that you would wanna expound on this particular question that you would want an attorney Trinidad to respond to?
Yeah,
Right, right.
Attorney, and Doc, I just would like to add on the information that Attorney Nick said, no, yung about the issue of whether you are free to disclose or free to consult. Hindi pala yung ano. Kasi there's a difference between the provision against non-disclosure or yung non-disclosure provision or agreement, confidentiality, and the freedom to consult, no, on the part of the worker, no, with respect to how the provisions would impact, no, his employment, etc. So in addition to that, no, as a practical response to, and we have been receiving such questions, we have talked to most of the foreign employers we have been dealing with. Now, since 2018, 2019, we have been meeting with them, and we have told them that, please, it is it is just and right for you to make it clear that this policy against non-disclosure does not include no issues relating to or the concerns of our nurses with respect to how the contracts are interpreted. So, ibig sabihin, if they have confusion or if they have doubts about how the provision is to be understood, they should be free to consult their own lawyer or they should be free to consult polo for that matter. So it has also been made clear to the employers. At I hope for those who are listening right now, kung meron sila mga employers at yun na yung mga nakausap namin, the employer should be reminded and you should be assured, yung ating mga nurses, that alam na nila yan. We have an understanding na hindi pwedeng gamitin yung non-disclosure kasi talagang hindi naman talaga dapat gamitin. Kaya lang pag may threat na, oy, you're not supposed to share your contact with anyone else, parang ang natatakot yung ating nurses kaagad.
Mhm.
But
Right.
we have already raised this as a practical issue, and second, legally naman talaga, it's not the same concept that we are that the non-disclosure provision is trying to tell our nurses. Iba yun. So, andun yung sa context ng hindi ka pwedeng mag-share kasi may may competition issue, no, fair
Mhm.
competition issue. Wag mo i-share yung trade secrets, etc., which is natural, no, in any business. Pero pag meron kang doubt, pwede kang magtanong. Libre po. Sa lahat ng mga nakikinig ngayon, libre ang magtanong sa Philippine Overseas Labor Office at sa Philippine Government kung may mga doubts man kayo doon sa mga provision ng kontrata.
Okay, thank you for that, Attorney. Doc, anything else about this particular question? Just to comment though, may nagsasabi kong nakasave ba daw yung video? Yes, it is actually saved in the Refora page as well as in our individual pages. Pati sa Polo web page yata din nakasave din to. So you could basically review this later.
Right.
Okay, Doc?
And yeah, so like what I said earlier, we've heard of some agencies that are forcing nurses to sign within for few hours without even having the ability to actually review the contracts. And like for me as a nurse, I don't know any legal jargons. If you give me 5 6 page contract, 10 pages, it really gets very overwhelming and intimidating. So, and I think yun talaga yung dapat nating i-drill to our Filipino nurses, to be proactive and seek an advice of a lawyer who really knows, the jargons, and to protect their interests. Kasi like what you said, attorney, earlier, pag na-sign na yan, when you sign it, it's a done deal. So it'd be hard to contest that if it's an enforceable provision. It'd be hard to contest that. So it pays to really read into it, but also consult someone who could really dissect it for us. Because contracts, to be honest, are intimidating, especially for nurses. We just want to work in the US, but contracts are such jargons for us.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Doc. And then your next question.
And the next question that we have from nurses is, what constitutes a breach of contract? Since we're talking about contract provisions and all that.
Okay. Attorney, do you want to say, comment on that first?
Um, that's a loaded question, no?
Okay.
Kasi maraming puwedeng manganak, eh. What is breach, and any, do all forms of breach, yung mga violations constitute a material breach, yung mga iba't iba, no? So,
Mhm.
basically, pag sinabi mong breach of contract, any violation in your agreement, no? And
Mhm.
ang pwedeng issue doon is if that particular breach would amount to a particular consequence or not, or ano ba yung mga remedies or reliefs available to each party. It would largely depend on the agreement, no? On the contract itself. No? So yun talaga,
Contract.
kaya sabi natin very material yan na um, meron kasing iba na very specific at we parang we like that, no, na pag sinabi what is a breach of contract, dinidefine niya mismo sa kontrata niya na the breach would constitute, this acts would constitute a breach of contract and would amount to whatever, no. So basically yun no, pag merong paglabag doon sa napag-usapan doon sa kontrata, it could constitute breach, no. As to whether it is material or not is another issue, no. So yan yung malaking question. Kaya every time that we are confronted with the contract, nagtatanong kaagad kami kasi nakalagay doon breach ay material breach of the contract. So yan lang isang cause of termination. Eh, hindi naman namin alam kung ano, hindi pa natin alam, no, kung ano yung material breach. It would depend on the parties, no? So yan yung dapat maintindihan ng ating mga nurses. But in any case, of course, yung breach could refer to an agreement as to the term, no? Ito yung very common, no? Yung breach of contract, ibig sabihin, hindi mo sinunod yung term as agreed upon. Kung 3 years, 3 years. Ngayon, kung pinutol mo, may breach yan. No? Pwedeng it could refer to the term. Two, it could refer to obligations of both parties under the contract. No, yung obligation mo magbigay ng serbisyo, hindi mo ginawa. So, breach yun. On the part ng obligation ng employer na magbayad ng tama, breach yun, di ba? So, conditions, so terms and conditions that are found in the contract and which have not been complied with, this could constitute breach. So,
Mhm.
ito yung basically, no, that's why I'm saying ano siya, very loaded, marami siyang sanga. Pero I think
Right.
what interests our nurses at this point are basic and very common issues of whether if you leave your workplace um wi- uh, shorter than the expected term, would that be breach, no? So plainly, I could say, no, at this point na syempre may paglabag ka kasi ang pananagutan mo is 3 years. In the same way na dun sa kabila din, pag pinaalis ka niya ng below or shorter than the 3 years, pwede ring breach. Pero iko-qualify na naman natin yan kasi sa contract meron din nakalagay that each party could terminate at will. May mga ganon. So,
Mhm. Right.
um, I mean, I don't know if I'm making sense to all the who are listening right now, but basically, if you talk about a breach, it's a violation of the terms and conditions in the contract of employment. So it would largely depend on how a breach is treated by the terms and conditions to as stated in the contract. Kaya mahalaga no na mag-consult po kayo ng iba't ibang opisina ng Philippine government, or if you have a lawyer of your own choice, you should be able to consult. Suffice it to say that this is a very important issue that should also be attended to seriously by each party, especially our workers or our nurses.
Okay, thank you on that, attorney. No? So again, just like what Attorney Trinidad said, anything, kaya nga nagsimula kami and we spent an ample amount of time explaining the concept of an agreement na or a contract. Kasi
Mhm.
anything that you agreed on, and by the fact na pumirma ka nun, nag-agree ka in all provisions of the contract and all the terms, liabilities, and risks that is embedded on that. No? Kasi
Right.
anything that is a deviation of that is a breach. Ang question na lang ngayon whether it constitute a material breach or not. So I'll give you an example. Ito very exaggerated examples lang to ha. So kung kunwari sa kontrata mo sinabi sa'yo na ang signing bonus mo ibibigay on the day of your arrival. Pero nung dumating ka, wala namang signing bonus binigay sa'yo after the 15th day. Is it a breach? Of course. Kasi hindi yun sinunod sa usapan nyo. Is it a material breach? I don't think so. No. Kasi what constitute a material breach kasi is that the breach or the non-compliance itself is so deep enough that could actually make the contract unenforceable or hindi na siya mapufulfill. Halimbawa,
Mhm.
I'll give you an example now. Normally, ang kontrata kasi ng mga nurses is contingent upon na yung nurse pagdating niya sa US, kumpletuhin niya yung unrestricted state license. Agree? Most common. Ganun yung
Right,
mga
right.
requirements, no? But for purposes of whatever reason, umabot na siya ng 2 years, hindi pa rin siya makakuha-kuha ng state license. Then, it will be considered a breach. And then, the employer will be justified and say, hey, you materially breached the contract kasi 2 years na hindi ka pa rin makapag-work sa akin kasi wala kang license. No.
Right.
So, another example of, in the contract, it actually says that the employer has the responsibility of providing a safe working environment, right? Ang maraming reklamo sa ano natin is, di ba, hindi masyadong maayos ang setup ng facility, right? Or they actually
Right, right.
keep sick at night or kung umuwi siya, and then you basically discuss that with your employer or your HR pero wala siyang ginawa, then it could
Response.
potentially affect your ability to perform your obligations under the contract. Then basically, if you don't show up anymore, it is a breach, and I would agree that it is a material breach.
Mhm.
Right? I hope you could actually see the big difference between a normal breach and a material breach. And for purposes of, before kayo tumawag sa office nila, Attorney Trinidad, I think what they will be interfering with is material breach of contracts. No? Tama, attorney? No? Kasi kung simple breach lang, normal yung kontrata nyo, nakasulat din doon kung ano yung procedure if there is a material breach. No? Kung sa tingin nyo, merong malaking pagkukulang yung employer nyo, normally sinusulat doon sa provision na, hey, you have to inform HR or your direct supervisor about your concerns. And once it's raised, you have to give them at least 30 working days or calendar days for them to remedy the breach. Para i-correct nila yon. Ngayon, kung hindi pa rin nila na-correct, then that's the time that you would consult either an employment lawyer or you could basically risk it to any avenue, including the office of Polo. No? Kung talagang hindi na niya kaya. Okay? So, again, go back to the basics. Before you sign to that contract, understand what your contract says, and then if you are in agreement of that, pirmahan mo. Kasi doon talaga yun yung basis mo when you start complaining now, breach of contract. And what is enforceable generally in courts are material breach of contract, hindi yung mga simple breach lang. Ngayon, attorney, merong scenario dito, no? And again, we don't have to agree on a situation. So this is a question from the audience natin. Doc, would you like to read that concern?
Yeah, so actually, Kay is one of the Lefora admins, And she asked if the contract says the nurse will be given 6 months orientation, but the employer did 1 week and left the new nurse by themselves. Does this imply the employer is breaching the contract?
Attorney?
Let's suppose that it's a hypothetical question.
Yeah.
So, I think, of course, no, based on the terms, I mean, hindi naman kompleto o nakalagay, no? Pero, based lang dito sa nakasaad na data sa atin, may nakalagay na 6 months sa orientation, pero ang binigay lang na 1 week. Tingin natin, no, merong pagkukulang, no? May non-compliance. Pero kasi baka may ibang ano pa to, may ibang conditions pa nakalagay, no? Kunyari kung 6 months sa orientation, ito yung buo na orientation, pero meron palang modification sa 1 week na orientation na that would also substantially address the 6-month orientation. Hindi natin alam yan. That's one. Second, yung 6-month orientation ba after nun binigyan ng notice ang ating employee na sinabing sa 6 months na to, 1 week na lang dating gagawin at nag-agree yung ating employee at naintindihan niya. Ibang question na naman yon, no? So, I mean, as I've said, no, this is a very loaded question, but for sure, I'm saying that this is not, if you said that it's a 6-month guarantee of orientation and only 1 week was given, there was breach, no? But as to the question of whether that is material breach that would amount to or constitute a justification to leave a contract or, I mean, leave a workplace or call the attention of the employer, that would largely depend on several circumstances. But suffice it to say, no, but what I can say is that you are free and you should be raising this as an issue because any observation that you will have resulting from the implementation of the contract will help you in the process. No, whether it could be building a case. I'm not saying that you should build a case against your employer, pero this could be some information that will help you later if you think that there are violations, no, committed by your employer. Ito yung pwede nating gawin. For sure, ang una kong i-advise sa iyo is raise this as a concern.
Mhm.
And let us see how the human resource or the employer will address it. And then second, after that, if they give you reason, and if you're not satisfied, then probably you can consult a lawyer or you can consult us and we can give you some advice.
Okay. Again, I agree with sinabi ni attorney, no, na again, mahirap kasi sagutin yung theoretical scenario kasi we don't know the outside considerations of that particular question. But let's just take this particular scenario as is, okay? So, ang sa akin, the way I look at it is, um, is it a breach? Of course, it is a breach. Is it a material breach? Not so clear, right? Kasi kung pag sinabi niyang basic orientation lang naman, but after that 1 week orientation, you would still be able to perform the job kasi general nursing practice lang naman siya, then I don't think I would consider it is a material breach because again, it will not stop the nurse from performing the job. But I also understand na some facilities, yung operations nila are too complicated na sa tingin ng nurse, hindi niya talaga, it will endanger his life or liberty or person as well as the safety of the patient kasi hindi siya na-orient ng tama, then I would consider it as a material breach. Ngayon, I agree with the remedy na hindi ka tawag agad ng lawyer, no? You have to raise your concern to your HR or your employer and give them the opportunity to correct kung ano man sa tingin mo is hindi nila sinunod. And again, if they don't listen to your concern, that's the time you call your employment lawyer, not an immigration lawyer, but an employment lawyer to address your concern. If hindi nyo kaya mag-ano ng lawyer, then maybe that's the time you're gonna reach out to the Polo office. Okay? Doc, do you wanna expand, comment on what we actually talk about this particular scenario lang naman? Doc, naka-mute.
Sorry about that. So I've heard of this scenario. Thank you for that, attorney. But I've heard of this scenario where they are employed by the hospital, but they also have a contract with the agency. So, assuming the hospital fired the nurse because it's at will, the agency now says, "Oh, you can't leave because you still have a contract with the agency." So, how does this work? Because they have an employer, the hospital, they have an agency that also recruited them and has a contract with them. So, are they following two contracts here? Who should be responsible, or what would happen?
Attorney.
Lahat ng question loaded pero tama, actually they are all happening, no? So I think it is now best to explain to our nurses that there are different models in the United States, there are
Mm-hmm.
models of employment even not in the United States, kahit dyan sa Pilipinas, no, meron naman yung sinasabi nating sino ba employer mo, siya ang nag-pull sa'yo pero ibang nagsusweldo, yung mga ganon, no? So what is essential in a contract of employment or in an agreement of employment is to determine who exercises power of control. No, ibig sabihin sino ang kumausap sa at nag-hire. No, sino yung nagsabi na magbibigay sa ng sweldo? At sino ba yung may power sa na mag-assign kahit saan at mag-fire sa no? I mean, these are basic universal principles of employment, no? Sinasabi natin just to determine whether an employee relationship exists. No? So, dito sa US, importante na makita mo sino ba ang visa sponsor mo. Kasi ang visa sponsor, yun talaga ang may responsibility sa inyo. Pasensya kasi may lag yung thought process ko pag nagtatagalog. Bisaya kasi kami ni Atty. Raquel. So, um, yung sino ba ang nag-sponsor sa'yo? No? Because based on US laws, the US sponsor must be responsible for a lot of things, including yung employment. No? Kasi siya yung may sa ibang petition may nakalagay lawyer ang nagsasign pero for and on behalf of the sponsor. So it is important for you to determine a visa sponsor. And then most always the visa sponsor is your employer. Yun yung una. Second, as I said, there are different models in the United States in a way that there are direct employers based on the US model. Ito yung healthcare organizations mismo talaga, facilities na kumakausap sa inyo at kumakausap din sa amin at nakikita din namin sa petition na sila yung pumipirma or kanilang representative. Yun yung unang model. Pangalawa, merong mga ahensya. No? Dalawang klase ng ahensya yan. Una, isang ahensya na kumakausap sa inyo at sinasabing, nagre-recruit kami ng workers sa Pilipinas, pero ang visa sponsor ninyo hindi kami. Kami lang, we're doing the work for them. We're recruiting for them. So those types of agencies are what we refer to as foreign recruitment agencies. So they are not the employers, but they facilitate the recruitment and deployment of nurses to the United States. But then please take note that when you receive your documents, usually what you will have and what you should have is a contract of employment with your real employer.
Right.
Correct.
And at times, there might be a contract between you and the foreign recruitment agency, but that will only spell as to how the recruitment process will be conducted and what are the obligations of your recruitment agency during the pre-selection, selection, and recruitment process. So that's the second model. Pangatlong model, ahensya din, pero these are staffing agencies.
Staffing
These
agent.
staffing agencies, they are your sponsors. Meaning, so what does it mean? They are your employers. And
Mm-hmm.
these staffing agencies are the ones which guarantee that they will provide staffing needs, the staffing requirements of healthcare organizations, which are their clients. But you note that in the case of staffing agencies, if they are your employers, they are the ones who farm you out.
Mm-hmm.
And then they are the ones who give you or release your salaries, and the salaries are released through not through them but by them.
Right.
No, so I think I will go to your question, no, yung question na sino ba ang ano ba to, ano yung question ulit, responsibility,
Kaninong
somewhat.
contract ako susundin? Yung sa
Oo.
agency or yung sa hospital?
So yun, with your question, dalawa yun. Tanungin natin kung sino ba, anong model ba yun. Yung agency
Right,
mo,
right.
recruitment agency or staffing agency? Kasi mag-iiba yung sagot natin doon.
Answer, right.
So in the
Uh,
case of a recruitment agency, because your employer is the facility itself, then it's a question or an issue between you and
in the
the
facility.
facility.
Right,
So in the case of a staffing agency, even if the hospital, decides not to secure your services anymore, the obligation of the staffing agency remains because the agency is your employer.
Correct.
Nakuha niyo
right.
ba? So it is important. Ito gusto kong I would like to focus on it kasi ang daming confusion nito. Minsan ang maraming question is itong aking agency, siya ang sisisihin ko kasi itong ginawa niya, hindi niya ako binigyan ng accommodation, etc., etc. So tanungin ko, ano ba ang obligation? Ano ba ang nature nito? Kasi based sa records namin, recruitment agency mo lang siya.
Right.
Meron siyang obligation, pero kanino ba nanggagaling lahat ng resources? Doon mismo dapat sa employer mo. So if you
Mhm.
have a right of do you have a right of recourse against the agency? Probably. But do you have a right of recourse against the facility if there's breach? Definitely. Yun yung sagot doon. In the case of a staffing agency, malaking responsibilidad ang nandoon sa iyong staffing agency kasi siya yung employer. Now, if there is a specific obligation that that facility failed to comply, then that is another matter, no? So, I mean, again, it would largely depend on the documents that you handle, on the relationship that you have with all these entities, and we will be able to determine which entity to answer or to address your concerns when the time comes. I hope I've made myself clear. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very clear. So I guess it all boils down to who really is the employer and what the contract says. Again, all boils down to seeking a lawyer's advice because these contracts are very confusing,
Mhm.
right?
I
And
don't
I think
intend I don't intend to add anything of what Attorney Trinidad said kasi basically you really have to understand, go back to the what model did exist in that relationship, no? Then ang sagot depende doon sa model na 'yan. May follow-up question lang si Cray.
Mhm.
Yung sinabi ba namin 30 days generic or applicable to all corporate lawyer, depende nga sa kontrata 'yon, no? So if those were not specified in the contract, then the company policy comes in. So then you have to go back to your handbook kung pag may mga ano kayo, grievance kayo, ano bang sinasabi ng handbook nyo kung how to air your concerns to HR or to management. Okay?
Mhm.
Attorney, mayroong question for you here. Doc, ano daw?
Attorney, the question is, Attorney Trinidad, I want to clarify, can we send our contract for clarification sa Polo office if pwede, how do we do it? Can we do it through email? I want to do a per diem work in another hospital, but I'm not sure if I'm allowed to do it since I'm still under my original contract. Not clear because it's a contract because of the complicated clauses. Thank you. That's from Sun.
Okay, thank you for that, San. Of course, parang it's water under the bridge, no, na ang advice ko sana is even during the time that you read the contract and you were given the contract initially, you could have raised this question, no, para makita natin ano talagang intention ng iyong employer, no, yung parties. I think this is a good exercise. Thank you for this, Dr. Paul, kasi this will give our nurses an idea of what questions to ask when they are confronted with the contracts for the first time, no? So, wag po
Right,
kayong
right.
matakot na magtanong kasi nga
Right.
dapat equal footing tayo sana diyan sa contract formulation. Eh since ginawa naman ng employer nyo ang trabaho na mag-formulate ng contract, ang trabaho na lang natin is pag-aralan ng masinsina, no, ang kung ano nakalagay, and then we can make proposals. We should be making proposals. We should be raising questions, and seek clarification such as this, no. So on your first question, of course you can ask us about it, send us to our email. I will paano ko ba, hindi ako marunong, hindi naman nakikita dito, Attorney Caracal, kung magte-text ako or but anyway, later on I will give you our contact details. It will be in my slide presentation later if we have enough time. But then, yes, you can send for consult. You can even ask your own lawyer if you're comfortable with your own lawyer. Second, as to that question, of course, initially, as I said, there is nothing wrong with asking your human resource, how are these provisions interpreted? Is this in such a manner that I'll be allowed to do that? But normally po, ang alam natin, no, especially in these cases, kaya nga dun sa ano sa non-disclosure agreement, etc. And competition issue, and concepts of unfair competition, hindi talaga, you're not even allowed to work within a particular period of time doon sa isang facility na pareho ng negosyo ng pinagtatabahuan mo. No? So, yun yung very normal, no? And that is not only in the case of contract of between nurses and the employers, but in any other contract, no? Kunyari kahit nasa isang ano ka, na isang service facility ka, gano'n din, eh, na within a particular period of time, hindi ka puwedeng mag-hold ng office or hold position in the same category or
Capacity.
same trade or same business, 'no.
Yeah.
So, I think it's a common, and based on principles, commercial law principles, that is allowed.
Right. Kasi attorney dito sa States, like as a hospital, full-time job is 3 days. So we have 4 days a week that we don't do anything. And like for me, single, I'm lucky because my contract was simple and it didn't say anything like you can't work anywhere on your off. So I started picking up per diem, but I did clarify it with my agency and my hospital. They said as long as it does not affect your full-time schedule, it's okay. But again, I had to clarify with them because I didn't want to make a mistake. I was new, and again, things like that can be confusing. But I guess it's all boils down to what the contract says. And tama ka dun, attorney. Nurses should also really know how to ask questions because sometimes we just base it off verbal agreement and then just sign the paper without actually reading what's in it.
Yeah. So I will just add into the immigration aspect of every question. No? So in that particular question kasi, yung ano, yung pwede bang magtrabaho kasi hindi for whatever reason kulang yung sweldo ko or may enough may free time naman ako, pwede ba akong tumanggap? So it all boils down to what the contract says. If the contract says you are 100% committed to us, you cannot work for others, then
Mhm.
unfortunately you cannot do that because if you do that, then you are breaching the contract. No? Pero
Right.
kung wala namang ganon, being a green card holder doesn't limit you for getting second job, third job. So you are allowed to take more jobs as long as you can, and it's safe to you for you to do that kasi walang restriction ang green card holder.
Green
But
card
then
holder.
again, your ability to work for more than one employer depends on what the contract says.
Right, right.
Okay? Ngayon, may question tayong another dito. Doc.
So, from Anthony Hypo, would it be a breach on their part if the job description when starting to work as for a floor nurse pero pinapag-work as a supervisor? I've approached HR, ang sabi nila, all RNs are trained as supervisors.
Okay, can I first start talk about this now? And again, I'm trying to bring in the immigration component of the question.
Mhm.
This could be a potential problem though, kasi this might be construed as a scheme of an employer saying that for purposes of filing the prevailing wages, I was only hiring a registered nurse. But
Mhm.
then, in reality, my intention was, pag nandito na sila and they are already green card holders, I will actually require them to work as a supervisor. No?
Right.
This is, magkapatid lang siya na scenario ng fraud finding ng mga immigration cases before when there was actually retrogression na dahil nga to avoid retrogression, yung mga employers would actually file supervisory or managerial jobs
Mhm.
kasi walang retrogression ng categories na yon. But pagdating dito, ang trabaho, registered nurses. So this is
Mhm.
basically the opposite of what they're trying to do. Ngayon, how do I see this? Pag kunwari registered nurse ka as based on your job description and that is actually tama dun sa prevailing wage and the petition that is being filed for you, which is EB3. No? Pag ang kunwari, totoo talaga yung intention ng employer to say na, hey, you know what? I actually start throwing you some additional tasks because I would want to see you as a supervisor 6 months from now or 1 year from now, then it's a legitimate development plan for that particular nurse. Pero kung nagiging normal na talaga, I think it could be a potential fraud,
Right.
right? Because it
Agreed.
becomes a scheme. But again, you have to look into that. I would recommend again, as much as you could actually have that conversation internally, have that conversation internally. But if you think that your concern is not being addressed, then maybe that's the time that you first talk to, in this particular case, I would say, talk to an immigration lawyer kasi there's a potential problem in this particular fact pattern. So assume lang natin
Right.
questions, hypothetical ha, para hindi maano yung mga nagre-raise ng questions, sinishare pa naman natin. But
Right.
yeah, it's a potential concern. Attorney Trinidad, what can you say about this particular fact pattern?
Of course, I cannot officially and legally comment on the immigration aspect, no. Pero ang tingin ko lang, no, of course, yung expectation doon sa what is stated in the contract is much different from what actually happened. So there is a potential I mean question of whether the contract was complied with. Yan yung tingin ko una. Second, of course, ang concern naman ng Philippine government basically, without still looking into immigration aspect, etc., is ano ba ang consequence if you have been given the job, or you have been your services were secured as a floor nurse, as compared to your actual job of being a supervisor. Now, will it impact on the benefits, etc., that you're receiving? That's one. Second, will that have an impact on the skill set that are required for both, no? Kasi potentially baka issue ng license, I mean, risk doon sa iyong um, license, etc., ito, no? So these are things that we are looking into, no, na baka may mga ah, potential na liability issue sa'yo na hindi naman dapat i-attach sa'yo kasi ito yung original na job description mo.
Right.
So, I mean, these are things, no? And in all cases that these matters are brought to our attention, what we usually do is seek clarification, no? Again, with the employer, if the nurse or the requesting party allows us to do that, we seek clarification so that we could provide some advice and provide an avenue for the worker and the employer to continue this conversation kasi baka pwedeng mapag-usapan kung ano ba talaga nangyari dito and we can remedy.
Right. And also, I want to add on the nursing perspective of things. I have to remind nurses that aside from the job description that we have signed on when we got the offer, meron din tayong competency checklist or scope of practice. So if the task that they're giving to you is not in the scope, legally nurses can say no because it opens up a liability issue on our license too. So that one could be checked as well.
Okay, that's good.
Right. And right, I think we're good for the next question, attorney, because some of the questions on the comments are
Actually, may mga
related to it.
comment pa dito, Doc.
Oh, this one right here.
And
Yeah,
then we go
according
to the next question.
right, Lawrence said, "Hi, considered po ba breach of contract if ma-terminate ka before completing the 3-year commitment period?"
Okay? Well, it depends kung saang portion doon kasi masyadong malaki yung 3-year. Ang question kasi is, breach of contract ba if ma-terminate ka before completing the 3-year commitment period? If you will be terminated 1 month after within the 3-year, is a potential problem yun in the immigration side, no? But kung kunwari 2 years, 3 years ka na, I don't think that there is an immigration issue. But again, ano bang problema natin sa breach? Ang kinatatakutan lang naman natin sa breach is ipagbayarin ka ng employer mo, tama?
Right,
Kung
right.
terminate ka naman on your 2nd year at hindi ka pa pinagbayad, I think for me, again, it really depends on the reason, no, kung bakit kanya tinanggal. But if you think that you will have you have better opportunities outside of that employee, maybe a blessing in disguise for you, no? But
Right.
two worries mo lang naman dun eh. Will it affect my immigration status? Again, if you are being terminated in the first 6 months, may potentially problematic yun, no? Pero kung ang takot mo is on the amount side, kung generally naman, we will talk about the remedies, buyout amounts, kung ang reason naman ang nag-breach naman at nagtanggal sa'yo is for cause, wala ka namang liability sa employer mo eh, no? Normally, pinagbabayad ka lang naman ng employer kung may kasalanan ikaw, no?
Mhm.
Or as long as those 2 areas are covered, you should be okay. But then again, mag-1 hour na tayo almost, nasa question number 2 pa tayo, Doc, so we have to move on.
All right.
Sinasama natin question yung
And
preparation.
third question, are buyout provisions legal?
Okay, so this should be very quick, no? Are buyout provisions legal? I think so because kung illegal yan, wala yan sa contracts, no? So the
Right.
buyout provisions are basically intended to serve as the damages, no? Pag-usapan natin mamaya whether it's a penalty, liquidated damages, and daming klaseng damages. But if the question is a buyout provision legal? Yes, no? Kasi kung illegal yan, then no contract should have a buyout provision. Attorney?
Yeah. Well, what confuses me though is, I mean, buyout provisions generally, no, they are generally acceptable, but in the context of our nurses here and based on the contracts that we're accepting and we are looking at, we don't see any buyout provision actually. What we see are provisions on liquidated damages or actual damages. So, posibleng magkakabit ito silang dalawa pero hindi, no? Kasi yung buyout parang the concept there is that one party wants to I mean to redeem or gusto niyang bayaran kung ano yung um, potential na loss, no? Yun yung ano, pero ibig sa ang presumption dito is yung employee na ang nag-o-offer na i-buy out ko 'yan, no? Yan 'yon. In the contracts that we're seeing, it is the employer which imposes the obligation on the part of the employee that if you terminate, you have to pay for damages, liquidated or provision or actual damages, no? So doon ang nakikita kong context nitong buyout, no? And it is where when the Philippine government has taken its position that you cannot put a provision there that exclusively provides that relief or remedy for the employer for liquidated or actual damages, no? I will explain later. Ibig sabihin, since 2020 wala na dapat kaming makita na exclusive na remedy diyan na kung may nangyayari or termination ng contract, magbayad ka agad itong ating nurse. So since 2020 wala na po dapat sa mga provisions yan ng kontrata. Kung
Okay.
dumaan sa Philippine government yan, because that is what at this point is the Philippine government is enforcing. As to whether there are remedies for our employers or the employee, that's another question. Now let's just stick to the issue on liquidated and actual damage provisions. Effectively, we have deleted these provisions, but we will discuss what the reasons are later on.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, sounds good to know, attorney. Thanks for letting us know about that.
Okay. Thank you, Attorney. Next question, Doc.
And number 4 question is, can another agency or employer buy out a nurse's contract?
Okay. I'll answer this question first. No? Can another agency or employer buy out a nurse's contract? It really depends on a lot of factors, though. So I don't think, are they happening? Sometimes, right? Is it a good business ethical practice? No. No? Kasi kahit naman ikaw, employer ka, merong mag-i-encourage na aalis yung nurse mo kasi sila na bahalang magbayad ang contract. Pangit yon na practice, correct? But I have to, meron lang tayong provision dito or doctrine or principle that we would actually want to raise. And I'm gonna warn individuals or companies who are actually deliberately encouraging other people to breach a contract kasi part yan ng torts area eh. So there is actually the deliberate interference with contracts, right? This is the tortious interference of contract. It can be, you can be sued if you are actually deliberately encouraging another employee or nurse or kung sino man yan to leave their contracts, no? Ibang usapan naman, yung halimbawa ako, kunwari, I was working as an engineer before, but for whatever reason, gusto kong mag-explore in other companies. And then, I applied for another company, and then that company actually likes my performance or the way I answer the questions, and they said, hey, we are interested with you. Then I tell them, ay, meron akong contract. I am actually tied to a contract na pag umalis ako, within 3 years, I have to pay you $20,000. And then that company actually offer na, don't worry, just give a copy of the contract. We will give you $20,000 to pay that. That's allowed generally kasi hindi naman sila yung nag-encourage sa'yo eh, ikaw yung lumapit sa kanila. No? So again, to summarize this, can other agency or employee buy out nurse's contract? they can if they want to, but that is really bad business practice, no? But if the other person could actually show na itong tao na to or yung employer na to deliberately encourages other person, they can be sued for damages though under torts. Attorney?
Actually, wala akong comments sa issue na to. Because, in fact, we are discouraging, of course, we want our workers to stay on in their contracts of employment as long as the work environment is just and safe. But then we also respect that this could be happening, but we don't have a policy on this, and we don't even personally, I don't even want to dignify, no, this practice, no, na
Hmm.
pwede pa lang mag-buyout. I mean, it's the practice of companies of doing that could be poaching, as
Correct.
Attorney Caracal said, and that could have legal consequences.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. Next question though.
And the next question is, will contract buyouts affect US citizenship applications? I guess this also talks about breach of contract fees, buyout fees, something like that.
Okay, so will contract buyouts affect citizenship application? Generally naman, hindi naman, right? But then, when a person buys out the contract, right, they actually try to breach the contract then. And then, basically, depends on which part of the process you are in. And as a matter of fact, a month ago, may nag-consult sa akin kasi nag-apply sila ng embassy na approve siya. Upon issuance of the visa, nasa Philippines pa siya, nag-buyout na siya. Sabi ko, "Ma'am, what are you doing?" Right?
Oh,
Because that's
wow.
completely fraud, right?
Right.
So may mga scenarios din tayo na dumating sa US after 1 month to 3 months nag-buy out and then lumipat 5 years later nag-apply, then that's fraud, no? Kasi if you're actually leaving your petitioner right after you arrive in the US, anong assumption ba ng immigration? You remember during your consular embassy interview kasi tinanong ka kung sinong employer mo. If you're actually committed to working for them and you answered yes, and you actually provided all documentation in support of your petition. So at that point in time, you really give the impression that you will be working for that employers for the duration of the contract. Then pagdating dito, 1 to 3 months later, umalis ka. So you would probably committing fraud because you misrepresented at the time of your interview at the embassy. Again, that is not an absolute rule, di ba? Kung ang reason mo naman na umalis ka kasi you don't feel safe, kasi yung working conditions ng iba, or there are abuse, and so on, ibang usapan na yan, right? But you have to document that in order for you to be able to defense mo yon pag 5 years later mag-apply ka ng citizenship mo. So, pag mayroong nagtatanong sa amin, generally what we actually say, if you could actually stay with your employer 9 months to a year before actually try considering leaving, then that's actually safer for you for immigration purposes at the time that you apply for citizenship. So, yun lang yung gusto kong sasabihin on that particular question, right? And I'm sure si Attorney Trinidad is hesitant to say that because that's a purely immigration question. So, careful lang siguro, no? So again, if you are already in the employer 1 year, 2 years, and you really would think to really breach your agreement and you're ready to pay that damages portion, in the immigration side, I don't see that as a big problem. But again, to be on the safer side, consult an immigration lawyer at that point before you actually
Right.
decide to breaching the contract. Question
Right.
on that, Doc? Clarification?
And attorney, I think I would just like to add, because I just got my citizenship recently, that during your application for citizenship, you're gonna write down all your residency and jobs in the last 5 years in the US. So I guess baka makita ng mga
Correct.
officers na bakit 3 months ka lang nagsistay sa job, or 2 months. Baka they might probe more questions. I'm just saying, but I have not experienced that.
Right. Maraming questions dito, Doc, but hindi ko muna i-share kasi
Opo.
they are actually referring to the amounts of the breach, which you actually have a
Right, right,
question about that. So, saka ko na lang i-share your screen. So, we move
right,
on to
right.
the next question then.
So the next question is, what is the is this it, attorney? What is the acceptable amount for a breach of contract?
Attorney, any comment on that?
It's a very tricky question.
Yeah, of course I started off with saying that we did away already with the all provisions on liquidated and actual damages. So that goes without saying that we cannot comment on the amount precisely because we are not even allowing that as a matter or as an exclusive remedy for the parties involved. No, so of course, as to what is decent or not, probably if kasi I mean later on I will tell you that instead of a liquidated damage provision, we're giving options to our workers and to the employers to avail of any legal remedy no that is allowed under the state where they that they agreed to be. I mean, to be the to be to where the cases or the matter should be addressed, no? Kung saang jurisdiction, anong state yon. So, suffice it to say that if in that particular state, allowed naman yung liquidated damage, I mean, granting without admitting that it is allowed, the question of whether it is decent or not would largely depend on circumstances. But of course, we have illustrative cases about this, no? May mga cases tayo that you can immediately research. And I will just quickly, if I may be allowed, Attorney Caraquel, to mention Pagirigan case, and then there's the what's this the recent one in New York too. Saan ba yun yung malayo na medyo the farther part of New York, merong case din doon, no, which was handled providing for amounts that are very confiscatory, very onerous on the part of the nurses. Na, sabi
Mhm.
nila, pwede namang liquidated damage pero hindi ganun kalaki. So it would largely
Yeah.
depend on the circumstances.
Right.
So medyo loaded yung question. As to
I've heard one agency attorney 150,000, and this is not a joke because was posted in Lefora a few years back, but $150,000
Yeah, and I
for
have to
breach of
quickly
contract.
comment, Dr. Paul, by any and all
Right.
means that is onerous,
Uh-huh.
unacceptable. In
Exorbitant.
any court, kahit saan yan, kahit saan dalahin, talagang hindi mananalo siya. Pasensya.
Correct,
Right,
yes.
right. That's true.
And again, just like what sinabi nga ni attorney, it has to be looked at in a case-to-case basis, Doc, eh. Kasi kung kunwari, yung nurse na assigned in a very remote, small town state where, let's just say, for purposes of conversation, the annual compensation is only 40,000 a year, and then yung breach amount mo is basically 30,000, you basically work two-thirds of your year just to pay the compensation. So, again, the proportion of
Right.
your gross income as to the amount of your damages is too high. That makes it parang ano na siya, hindi na siya reasonable. And if I were the employment lawyer at that point, I would fight that kasi nga hindi nga siya reasonable. Okay? So we're gonna move to the next question.
And the next question is, will nurses be in
Ay, teka lang
danger
daw,
of
sorry pala. Sabi ko maraming
yes,
question
yes,
involving amounts, no? I will just show one and then maybe mag-comment
yes.
na si Attorney Trinidad.
Oh yeah, here. From Ruby, she said, hello po, ask ko lang, since nag-start po visa application, 3 beses nag-change yung contract ng facility, dumami po yung demands. Yung latest po, pag di natapos ang contract, kahit ano pong reason, magbabayad ng 20,000 US dollars plus 1,000 per month na di natapos. Tapos bawal po mag-work sa iba. Yung unang contract po, walang ganun. Paano po kaya yun?
Uh, I have to be very straightforward, Ruby. Kung ngayon at dadaan yan sa amin na kontrata, talagang hindi papasayan.
Mhm.
So, ibig sabihin, we will really request the employer to remove that completely, no, if there is a provision on that. Kasi at this point, there is an ongoing policy against it in as far as we are concerned. But as to whether that could be agreed on later on and if it is allowed in the particular state, kasi meron nga tayong alternative formulation, depende po yan. No? So, yun yung una kong ang sagot diyan, no? So, ang kung may negotiation niya, ang una naming sagot is hindi. Ngayon kung merong
Mhm.
mga opening diyan, depende na. So, I don't know if I've answered your question, ma'am, but yun po yung tingin ko, no? So, pangalawa, kung may, I think you are still allowed if at that particular stage, if that is still an initial stage with modifications in your contract, you could still ask for some clarification on that.
Okay. Next question.
And next question is, will nurses be in danger of deportation if they buy out their contracts?
Generally, no. Buying out a contract is not a ground for deportation, ha? Just be straightforward, clear on that. But it's actually the reason of the buying out that could potentially lead to the deportation, right? Kagaya na sinabi ko nga kanina, nung binay out mo yung contract, 3 months ka pa lang doon sa petitioner mo, then the officer could actually look at that, that you're committing fraud when you obtain that green card. Matideport ka
Right.
because ang finding ng USCIS sa'yo is you don't deserve the green card in the first place because before ka pa lang pumunta ng US, meron ka ng intention to really leave your petitioner. And that's why we are actually
Right.
saying na dapat consult with the immigration lawyer first before really deciding on buying out a contract, especially if you are in the early stages of your journey in the United States. Now, again, buying out of contract generally is not a ground of denial, no? The most common ground of being deported after applying for a citizenship application is basically my criminal record ka, my fraud ka. Then, if those applications were denied, you will be asked to appear before the immigration judge and then explain why you should actually keep your green card status. But to answer this question, the simple act of buying a contract will not make you deportable. Okay? I hope that clarifies that question. But careful when you are deciding to buy out the contract, when you are in the first stages of your employment period.
Yeah, because I know I've heard some agencies telling nurses that, oh, we will report you to USCIS so they can deport you. I guess because
Okay,
there was a
yeah,
disagreement with buying out or breaching the contract, something like that.
right.
But
That's very common feedback that you would actually receive. But trust that minsan kasi tactic yan ng HR, di ba? Takutin ka. No,
right, right,
i-intimidate ka, takutin ka kasi they want you no? Kasi pag umalis ka, mag-hire na naman sila ng bago, titrain na naman nila yon. They are not so sure if they would like the person, this manner that they like you, right? Kasi naririnig mo lang naman yun sa mga employer na ayaw kang umalis. Kasi
right,
kung gusto ka nilang umalis, they will not even attempt to talk to you, to keep you, no? But yung mga HR na kinakausap ka ganyan, they want you to stay, no? Can they report you to USCIS? Yeah, of course. You cannot stop them from calling USCIS na, hey, umalis ka na. Eh, kung you've been there for 2 years, 3 years, anong gagawin ng USCIS? Right?
right.
Probably, they would confront you at the time of you applying the citizenship. Kasi may record sila na nag-send ng letter or complaint yung employer mo sa'yo. And again, for as long as you would be able to demonstrate and answer na, hey, I stayed there for 2 years, I have a good performance rating, I did my job completely and correctly, then should be no danger of or fear of being deported or even being denied of your citizenship application. So,
Right.
intimidation tactics lang yon. It doesn't
Right.
necessarily mean na madideport ka simply because nag-buyout ka at sinumbong ka ng employer mo.
Right.
Next.
Next question we have is, in case of breach, when and in which scenarios should a nurse seek the help of a lawyer?
Attorney?
Um, parang it's a very I for me it's a very it could be both dalawa no personal and legal. Personal, it would depend on your personal comfort, no? Kung tingin mo at any stage you want to consult a lawyer or consult polo, that is your prerogative. And sa case naman ng polo, as I said, no, libre ang magtanong sa amin. So, tingin mo lang na meron kang doubt, etc., we will be willing and we are always willing to address your questions and concern. Yan yung first. Second, legally, of course, no? Pwede ka talagang magtanong. Wala, 'di ba? You can not only ask questions, you can seek redress. I mean, these are some rights that you have, no? So, yung scenario kasi medyo very general siya.
Broad, yeah.
Yun na nga. So, kaya sabi ko personal. Sa personal comfort mo, feeling mo kahit konting issue lang, gusto mo magtanong sa lawyer, pwede naman. Kasi I mean, kami naman, the moment that you seek an advice, whether it is trivial or not, bound na kami, no? If we begin giving you an advice, bound na kami ng confidentiality niyan eh. Hindi naman namin
Right.
ipagsasabihan lahat, 'di ba? So, wag kayong mabahala, no? Siyempre, ibang question, maraming consideration pag nagtanong ka ng lawyer. Of course, merong lawyer na magbigay ng libre, merong lawyer na hindi, no? So, kaya nga personal comfort 'yon. Pero on the other hand, sinasabi ko naman na ang Philippine government through us, you could always go to us and ask us questions. So, I don't know if yun yung tingin ko, no? But tama yun, very important na if you see at first instance na merong question doon or issue sa implementation ng contract, it's really good to ask questions and seek help. Wag po kayong mahiya. Yan po yung pinakauna na napapansin namin. Minsan, you hesitate in asking questions even before any controversy starts. And then when you start and finally decide to ask that question, you're already deep into that controversy. And sometimes it would be very hard to remedy it. 'Di ba? So, hindi po dapat kayong mahiya. Mas maganda po na magtanong tayo and we seek assistance.
Okay, I don't intend to add more on what actually Attorney Trinidad says. No. Next question.
And next question is, are termination clauses valid?
Okay, first we need to understand what are termination clauses. Termination clauses, correct me if I'm wrong, attorney, no? Termination clauses are actually that provision in the contract that says this contract may be terminated upon the expiration of the terms of this contract, or can be terminated mutually or in writing by one person. Yung mga termination contract provisions, it actually says what will be the valid ground to terminate a contract, right? Or whether on that a contract can be terminated by one person only or two persons only, and so on and so forth, right? So if the question kasi, are termination contracts valid? I think it should be necessary, no? Kasi you don't want to be tied up. Hindi lang siya yung validity, no? Kasi it should be valid. Kasi hindi naman siya against the law, or hindi naman siya against public morals and so on. But I believe that this provision should be in every contract because that gives any party the opportunity to say, hey, I would want to terminate the contract because you are materially breaching the contract, or hindi na ako masaya sa relationship na to, and so on and so forth. So, yan lang yung masasabi ko doon sa question na yan. Attorney Trinidad?
Thank you, Attorney Caracal and Dr. Paul. No? From the perspective of Polo, we we expect termination clauses to be present in the contracts, no? And for purposes of template, meron po kaming four instances of termination. No, the first one is a termination for cause by the employer. Ibig sabihin, merong pagkukulang yung employer na material material breach, violation ng contract, hindi pagbigay ng mga conditions, etc. Pangalawa, termination caused by the employee. No? Um, may mga causes for the termination by the employer of that employee, probably neglect, etc. No? Ito yung mga ibang grounds, no, na pwedeng i-terminate ang employee natin. Pangatlo, because there is an at-will employment doctrine in the United States, it is also reflected in our contract, no, na termination, you can terminate with notice, without cause, as long as it's with the period, may notice ka. Or pang-apat na termination is for causes independent of the will of both parties. Ano po yun? Kunyari, nagkasakit ka, hindi mo na kayang i-comply yung kontrato, or of course natural cause, no? Kunyari, I mean, hindi naman gusto nating mangyari to, pero kung namatay, alangan naman sino pa magko-comply ng kontrata. So these are four instances where termination could be had. And I agree that termination clauses should be there to provide clarity, no? There should not be any ambiguity dito sa kung paano ka mag-terminate, at kung gusto mong bumitiw or kayong dalawa bumitiw. No, that would be beneficial to both parties.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. So that actually ends our conversation about contract buyouts or damages. No, so can we just ask two more questions related to this before we go to the next topic, which is human and labor trafficking? Attorney,
Yes.
Doc, read the question, please.
Yes, Jay, one of our viewers said, same lang po ba ang contract and job offer letter? I don't have contract, only job offer. Secondly, naka-indicate po doon na I am at will employment. Ano po ibig sabihin nun? Thanks.
Attorney, do you wanna comment on this?
Yeah, thank you, Attorney Nick. Ito, kaya nga nagsimula kami sa premise, no, na pag meron kayong napag-usapan, kontrata na yon. Minsan
Mhm.
nga sinasabi ko nga sa iba, no, I mean, not in the contract of employment, but in any type of agreement, kahit nilagay nyo yun sa toilet paper, eh pag nagpirma ka at nagpirma yung kabila at nagka-agree kayo, kontrata po yon. Contract
Mhm.
is simply the meeting of the minds of parties. Yan po yung pinaka-importante. But of course, in terms of form, we expect that contracts of employment should clearly provide for the terms and condition, yung template, no? Pero in our case, how do we see an offer of employment? If it contains all the terms and conditions, paano kasi sweldohan, ano ang mga benefits mo, anong obligation mo, etc., etc., that sufficiently satisfies the elements of a contract, no? Kasi nandiyan a contract of employment. Kaya lang, ito yung gusto naming i-insist, no? Pag nakikita kami ang polo ng ganito, pag may kulang, nagbibigay po kami ng notice of compliance. At doon natin pinupuno yung mga kulang. So I hope that it is clear, no? Because of course there's an offer of employment, there's a letter of employment, but also there are contracts with as Dr. Paula said, contains 9 to 10 pages na ang dami-dami na kahit kami ni Attorney Caraquel tatamarin kami magbasa even as lawyers, no? Pero yun na nga, ang basic is that a contract is a meeting of the minds of parties. So pag nandyan at pinirmahan yung dalawa, hindi pinagkaisa, na pag agrihan ninyo, ayan, hindi naman ako
Napagkasunduan.
Tagalog. Napagkasunduan, ayan,
Napagkasunduan.
hindi napagkaisahan. Napagkasunduan ninyo, kontrata po yun.
Yeah. Ito interesting to. Dalawang question na lang pala, Doc.
From Anna, does agency have rights to hold the applicant's green card?
No. Right? As a matter of
Right,
fact, a green card is owned by the applicant, ha?
right.
No? Pwede mong, it can be actually construed, ang the same ano lang to, attorney, the same argument lang that passports are a person's property. No one
Mhm.
should be able to hold it against your will kasi kinuha niya yon against your will, no? And green cards are owned by but whose name is on that card. And no one should be able to hold it against his or her will. Pwede mong idemanda yung nag-hold na yan. Okay? Kasi may other remedies naman eh. Bakit pa i-hold ng agency yung green card mo? In the same manner na i-hold niya yung passport mo. No? Holding someone's
Right.
passport could affiliate towards the next topic natin into the labor and human trafficking issues, right? So, if may agency kayo na nag-hold ng green card, sumbong niyo. Right? Kasi bawal
Yeah.
yan. Okay? One last question on the breach of contract, Dr. Paul.
For from Bona, ask ko lang if my reason to buy out contract is overworked, like doing 150 to 160 hours per 2 weeks. And when the nurse says no, if they ask to work, someone in the higher level will ask you again the same questions that had no choice but to say yes. Is this a form of harassment? Been in the job for 5 months under 2 years contract. Thank you. I guess they're being asked to work excessive number of hours. I've never worked this much.
Wow.
Wow.
No, attorney, ano masasabi mo dyan?
If I may, I think if I have to look at the question, or even, I mean, respectfully, ma'am, the buyout is even not should not be in this particular question. Kasi if granting without admitting that these are the conditions on the ground, there is reason to to leave that workplace,
Right.
which is very abusive,
Correct.
and it
Right.
and violative of both the labor laws of the Philippines and US.
In the US, yep.
So
Hmm.
it's ano, parang walang issue dito yung buyout na ano niyan. If, in fact, there should be reason for you to sue or even
Right, exactly.
to file
Yeah.
a case against your employer if that
Hmm.
is so, no? So ikaw yung may remedy against the
Employer.
employer. You have to raise this as an issue, and we have we are confident that U.S. agencies are very big on this, and they could investigate, and they could even sanction
Mm-hmm.
employers in that particular
Right.
state.
Kaya nga from the beginning, again, we put in the fundamentals of what a contract says, right? Kasi, yeah, of all the questions that we actually shared here, ang context kasi is yung employee ang nagbe-breach ng contract, which is not necessarily true in all cases because the employer could also breach the contract, no?
Right.
Again, these are actually yung based sa fact pattern natin. This is an abusive employer, right? You could actually raise na this
Mm-hmm.
is no longer safe and healthy to work in this environment. And but by reason alone, you don't even buy out the contract again after anything like that. Just sue, right? Because that would actually give you a free way to walk out of your employment kasi this is not safe and healthy for you anymore. I would recommend again after you consulted with your HR and they don't actually correct the source of the breach, then consult an employment lawyer at this point.
Right.
Okay? So, I think okay na tayo dyan, Doc. We are now ready to do the second topic natin. And this is very quick. I only have two slides here. Labor versus human trafficking. Doc, can you actually share the context why this question was raised by the nursing community?
Yeah, so we've been in Lefora, we've been hearing cases where nurses are being forced to work in assignments that were not in the contract, or they were being told that they come over here to the States, wala silang job. Like they go to consular interview, they present a job offer that's non-existent. They come here to the States, wala silang job, and then they are told to wait, or they are forced to take another assignment. Say, for example, a nurse could be an OR nurse, but they'd force the nurse to do skills rehab nursing, which is totally out of the specialization of this nurse. So the nurses are not sure if this is a form of trafficking. Are they being forced to work, or are they being held against their will because now that the employer could not provide them jobs, and they're told you cannot leave, you have to stay here until we can find you a job, or you're forced to take this job, otherwise you can't have a job, something like that. So there's a lot of issues coming out right now because of that situation.
Okay, and I understand. I am aware of all those concerns because I also receive them in my daily consultations, right? But on the law practice side, though, you have to be very careful with what is a normal labor and human trafficking, and what immigration look at as a potential ground na pwede na talaga tayong magkaso ng human trafficking and provide immigration benefits for those who are victims of human trafficking. No? So let's start with the basics muna. So, for immigration perspective though, victims of human trafficking could actually avail of, even those who actually lost their status, could actually avail for the T visa. This is actually for the victims of human trafficking. But the law only looks into the certain victims of severe forms of trafficking in persons, no? So paano ba dinidefine itong category na to? So this is actually the modern day slavery through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. So, ito yung nire-recruit ka, pero fino-force ka i-recruit, no? By fraud. Dito papasok, Doc, yung sinasabi mo na ipinapramisan akong ganito, ganyan. Could actually fall into the fraud scenario or kino-coerce ka. Ayaw mo naman pumunta dito. But you actually heard in the news, right, na there are certain groups of nationals na they're actually brought from one country through the farm in Florida, I guess. So that's actually an
Right,
example
right.
of you are recruiting or bringing people against their will through force,
Mhm.
fraud, or coercion, no? So sa Philippines, I think magfo-force, wala pa ako narinig masyado na fino-force na nurse or kino-coerce na nurse pumunta sa Amerika. But there could be certain groups who are actually may misrepresentation or fraud. Dito nga papasok na pinapramisan sila ng certain types of work or certain locations. Pagdating naman dito, hindi naman totoo. And
Right.
the common example of this is could actually fall na papasok ka, di ba? Kasi may trabaho daw. Pero 5 months later, 1 year later, wala pa rin trabaho yung nurse. That could fall into fraud. Now, one element lang yon ng human trafficking. So let's go into the other component of human trafficking. there are two common grounds for severe forms of trafficking in persons. Those people who are actually recruited or brought by force or coercion or by fraud to conduct these two types of services or labor. Sex trafficking, ating alam na natin yon, right? But the labor trafficking for the purpose of involuntary servitude, no? Peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. This is very common in mga nakastay in na mga workers because there are still nurses who are actually required to stay in facilities and so on and so forth. But this becomes a difficult argument na even if na-prove mo na they were coerced or there is fraud, but they are freely living in their apartments and so on, then it will become difficult for them to show that there is involuntary servitude. Kasi if you were actually forced to work, then just leave, right? But you will have a bigger chance of winning the case on human trafficking if you are actually uh, anong tawag dyan? Yung hindi ka freely, you can go out of the house. Because you cannot leave the facility because you have to stay here. Wala kang car, wala kang ganito, wala kang ganyan. So then that falls into the involuntary servitude, right? Normally yung debt bondage din na sinasabi mo, Doc, no? Bawal akong umalis kasi may utang ka pa eh. Hindi pa bayad yung
Right,
place
right,
mo. No?
right.
Again, if you are freely living in a different house, you can just simply walk away, no? And that's why this is a very high, difficult, complicated case pag it involves human trafficking kasi talagang tinitingnan nila yung personal circumstance ng victim. But if there is really involuntary servitude at saka wala talaga silang freedom of movement that actually falls into slavery, then they could potentially win a human trafficking. So, to be honest, I really have difficulty in looking at a scenario where a nurse is trafficked unless again there are promises that were not materialized. That's one component only, but the other component is to show that there is involuntary servitude, there is debt bondage or peonage or slavery, and there is no freedom of movement. Kasi the moment na meron silang freedom of movement, they just leave, right? Yun lang yung ano. And I would encourage that if there are people who are actually falling into this, that they really would want to consult either a criminal lawyer, employment lawyer, or an immigration lawyer. Kasi there
Right.
are remedies available in all those areas. Eh. No? But ang masasabi ko lang, just to talk about the human trafficking side, hindi porket mahal ang siningil sa'yo as placement fees, human trafficking na yon. Hindi question na yung promise hindi tinupad ng employer mo, human trafficking na yon. It could actually fall into the breach aspect of the conversation, right? Where
Right.
employment remedies could actually fall in or in maybe obligations and contracts could actually fall in. But the moment na mapakita talaga nila na again involuntary servitude, may mga um tawag dito, slavery nang nangyayari or debt bondage, then that's when you could actually raise the human trafficking issue. And again, it is a very complicated topic. I would recommend na people who are actually falling or finding themselves into this area to really consult a lawyer. No? Again, lawyer non, family, criminal, immigration lawyers. Attorney, meron ba kayong mga cases na ganito na dumadating sa office niya?
Actually, may nakikita kaming mga potential, no? I mean, some flags, red flags, no? But I think and I mentioned it earlier, I would invite the nurses to look at the case. It's very instructive. Itong pagirikan versus prompt nursing. Kasi dito may declaration, no? May holding yung court na nagsasabi na itong kinasuhan ng mga nurses violated the TVPA, yung Trafficking Victims Protection Act, no? And I would just like to zero in on the question of what constitutes in this particular case, inexplain ng korte na involuntary servitude or restraint of movement, it would largely depend not it should be viewed not from the lens of the party that is being complained against, no? It should be viewed from the party na kung sino ang nagreklamo. If the feeling or if the if the sense of the complaining party is that he or she is restricted from leaving, the facility or leaving his or her workplace,
Mhm.
that should be considered by the court. Mahabang usapin ito, but ang gusto ko lang sana, if you have the time, uh, basahin niyo 'to. Total nandiyan naman, you can always, look it up, Google it up.
I'm about to read it. Thank you for
Yeah.
that, attorney.
And you
Babasahin
will,
ko.
oo, maganda maganda yung kaso na 'yan 'no. It's very instructive, telling you, in fact, at I think addressing the question of how much is enough for liquidated
Mhm.
damages and what really constitutes trafficking 'no. In the case of the nurses, maganda ito kasi nurses talaga ang pinag-usapan 'no. So you don't need to look at it as an analogous case or what. It talks about the situation of some nurses in a particular state.
2019 lang pala ito, attorney.
Yeah.
Very recent.
Yeah, so it is a good case. With your permission, Attorney Caracal. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I know. Yeah, okay, kay Cray na naman. So sabi niya, Doc, may tanong siya before we go to the
So,
topic.
for Attorney Nick and Attorney Angela, nag-over-recruit yung I think yung agency. Does this entail fraud, marketing fraud, employment fraud on the side of the employer or recruiter since they offered a job position that did not exist at all? I think this is connected to one of the questions earlier where nurses came over here, they don't have a job kasi sabi ng hospital nag-over-recruit daw sila. So now they have to wait until the positions are open. So I think it happened a lot in the past as well, but now it's gaining traction because so many nurses are here in the States walang job. So anong ramifications ng over recruiting? Is it fraud or
Yeah,
what?
it could actually potentially be an immigration fraud on the part of the employer, right? Kasi when you actually file a petition, you're actually saying that there is a legitimate job offer, right? Ang totoo naman pala, wala. As a matter of fact, at one point in time, di ba, naging stricto ang US Embassy na naghahanap talaga ng deployment order before the nurse could actually fly into the US. Kasi nagiging rampant nga yung scenarios where the nurses arrive in the US, then 5 months, 1 year later, wala pa yung trabaho. No? But kung ako yung affected na to, I would actually report the employer kasi potential immigration fraud yun.
Can I say something?
Yes.
That's from the immigration side. From the Philippine government side, if these employers are actually accredited by the Philippine government, usually during the accreditation process, nilalagay nila yung kanilang workforce requirement eh. Kunyari sasabi silang, we need 100 nurses and we have these facilities to support us with the same job order requests. No? So, kung nangyari ito at certified naman to lahat, no? This has consequence on a part of these employers with accreditation. It can lose they can lose the accreditation status. The sanctions could be imposed on them, and in fact, they could be blacklisted by the Philippine government. So, I would assume that this is a hypothetical question, but if it is a true one, please report to us, email us about this information about this because we want to check this out.
Okay. Good.
Attorney Angela, I hate to pop your bubble, but this is an actual scenario from one of the nurses that talked to us. So me, Kay, and Anna are all for admin, so we get these questions a lot from nurses that want to be anonymous. So thank you for giving your valuable tips, but I think tama yung sinabi niyo po na dapat i-report.
Yeah. The next two questions are really for Attorney Trinidad though. So, and that actually the last two questions we have. Before we give the floor to Attorney Trinidad to basically introduce to the listeners and viewers what Polo Office, which she represents, could help you with when kung mayroon tayong mga tawag nito, concerns, right?
Mhm.
Question,
And
Doc?
the next question is: are direct hires required to go through POEA?
Okay. um, yung yung direct hire na sinasabi natin, from the dalawa yan ha, yung direct hire na sinabi ko kanina na ang healthcare facility or hospital, direktang nagka-hire na walang, na hindi siya through a foreign recruitment agency but siya mismo. From the perspective of the Philippine government, direct hire would be the employer going directly to or dealing directly with the employee without a Philippine recruitment agency. Kasi the rule is the employer should be working with a Philippine recruitment agency. Now, but regardless kung ganun yung mode, which could be allowed on under certain circumstances, they still have to go through government procedures. And in this particular case, of course, we already have a newly created department, which is the Department of Migrant Workers, which will become fully operational next year. Then the direct hires, all the hires must go through the DMW. No, but I will qualify because if you're specifically talking about nurses, it has a hybrid approach. Maybe later I can discuss that.
Okay. Then another one is related question.
And the next question is: Are nurses covered by the direct hire ban from the Philippines?
Masyadong loaded yung question. Yung direct hire ba, actually direct hire or name hire as we also as we also called it, is generally prohibited under labor laws. Hindi talaga pwede under any circumstances. But there are exceptions. So I'll just zero in on one exception. Allowed ang direct hire or yung sinasabi nating employer directly hiring a worker without the assistance of a Philippine recruitment agency kung ang hinahire ay professional or highly skilled or skilled worker. No, yan yon. But with the condition that this worker, if he or she is hired, the contract of employment must be over and above the standards set by the Philippine government. And then another exception or qualification is that if an employer is required or is allowed to hire to the direct hire mode, that employer must not hire more than five. So maraming rules yun. Una, hindi talaga pwede. Ngayon kung pwede, pwede ka lang mag-hire kung professional or skilled. Ngayon, kung mag-hire ka ng skilled or professional, dapat pantayan mo or taasan mo pa yung standard set by the government. Pangatlo, hindi ka pwedeng lumampas sa 5.
Okay.
Limang
Doctor,
hires?
may question dyan.
Yes, 5
Um,
hire. So,
Oh wow. Attorney, the question is for our lawyers, if a direct hire agency failed to assist their recruited nurses in their transition to US for certain reasons such as lack of workforce, is there a legal breach that the direct hiring agency commits? I think it's a little vague, but
Are they talking about after arrival services, right? Giving them, kasi this is transitioning eh. No, so are they referring to the basic housing or accommodation or pagsundo ba sa kanila or setting them
yeah.
up? So yeah, so it's a little bit vague, but again, the way I actually see this is I don't see this as a problem on the immigration side, but it could be on the contractual side or in
Right.
terms of the responsibility to the government for failure to take care. Ano masasabi mo dito, Attorney Trinidad?
yeah, medyo loaded nga. Siguro, ano lang, quickly, parang mag-check lang tayo sa concept. Wala akong nakikitang direct hiring agency. Baka direct hire na employer. Or if may agency man, dalawa yon. Sinasabi ko nga kanina, staffing or recruitment agency. In any case, doon sa tatlong concepts na inintroduce natin, again, it would largely depend on what are the obligations of these entities based on the contract. No, kung hanggang saan ba yung obligations nila, and then let's take it from there. But normally, of course, we expect the employer to really take care of the employees even as soon as they arrive, no? Whether there is an additional requirement or obligation from the recruitment agency, that's good if it's in the contract. But in any case, the visa sponsor assumes full responsibility.
Okay, thank you for that. And now, again, we are done with this particular portion of kagaya ng, and again, we are actually thankful of our viewers for staying with us for almost 2 hours now. Nandyan pa rin sila, right? But if you actually had listened to all the questions that you talk about, breach of contract, human trafficking, mas dapat panoorin natin tong polo. Kasi pag may nagka-problema kayo, yun yung office na tutulong sa atin to address your concern and to talk with your employer to address your concern. Tama ba, attorney? So
Ah,
in that case, I wanna hand you over the floor to talk about your office.
Salamat po. And I will request Attorney Nick to assist me in the presentation. So, again, I hope it's not too late. I'm introducing myself as a representative of this office, the Philippine Overseas Labor Office. And next slide, we are the operating arm of the newly created Department of Migrant Workers. Kung naririnig niyo yung POEA, DOLE, OWA, ang ibang service, most of the services relating to overseas employment are now under the DMW. It's a new department, but we assure you that it has a rich experience in terms of overseas employment kasi yung mga services sa iba't ibang ahensya inalagay na natin dito. So, what do we do essentially? We make sure that the policies of the and programs of the Philippine government, as far as they are practicable and applicable in the US, are reflected, no? I mean, are enforced in the even in the United States, no, including in the protection of our workers, including nurses, no. So yun yung ating gustong iparating, no. So I think based on that you will have an idea of what we are. So basically, what do we do, sir? Next slide po, Sir Nick. Para madaling matandaan, gamitin niyo na din yung opisina namin. POLO, Promotion and Protection of all the rights and welfare of our workers, including nurses. We also provide on-site welfare services. We do enter into labor cooperation, and then we have the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration. If you are members, you can avail of that. Next slide, please. So, importante lang dito yung promotion and protection. Kung ano ba talaga ginagawa namin. So, kanina nagsasabi kaming, is your employer accredited, etc. So, we do basically a function as an agency, as an entity which would facilitate accreditation of employers and principals. The ideal scenario is that wala kayong employer na kakausapin or recruitment agency na kakausapin na hindi accredited namin. No, they cannot regularly, as much as possible, recruit or even commit to do acts of recruitment if they are not an accredited entity. So ano ba yung accreditation? We vet them. Kaya yung sinasabi ni Dr. Paul kanina, may trabaho ba talaga dito? Part po yan na accreditation process. We talk to the employers, we talk to our Philippine consulates general all over the United States. We confirm whether there are jobs existing as much as possible. We talk to the facilities. Do you really have jobs to offer? And how much really are you offering our workers? How much are you worth? Kanina nga, we had a meeting with a nursing agency and sinasabi nila, oh, we have 7 billion worth of assets, etc. So, in that particular case, we can be assured, no, na meron talagang capacity ito na mag-provide ng jobs at i-comply yung kanyang contractual obligation to our nurses. So, please allow us to do that job. And how so? We appeal to you that if you are being hired or recruited by a particular agency, please talk to us, ask us, or even go to our website and confirm whether these agencies or employers are accredited. That could help us, no? So, second, verification of individual contacts that will apply basically to H-1B workers. Hindi naman mag-apply ito sa ating mga nurses, but then this is necessary if they need an exit clearance. And the third one is we do post-arrival orientation seminars. As maybe you have heard, we already have reached out to more than 1,500 nurses and medical technologists over the 2-year period na pumasok dito sa US because we wanted them to know what are the services that we offer. Next slide, please. Sir Nick. So doon sa accreditation, ang gusto lang naming i-stress again na pinag-usapan na natin kanina, we did away with the provision on liquidated damages and actual damages. What we provided as an alternative formulation is this, sa bottom po na paragraph. I will read it. Termination by the employer before the end of the term without cause or without notice, or termination by the employee prior to the end of the term is deemed a breach of contract that entitles the aggrieved party, ibig sabihin pwedeng employer, pwedeng employee, to avail of the legal remedies under the laws of the state. Nakablanko yung state kasi pag-uusapan niyo kung saan, state of Virginia, state of etc. So again, we refer to what laws are applicable. So bakit po natin nilagay ito? Una, in under this provision, pwede bang liquidated damages? Possibly. Kasi nakalagay naman na pwedeng legal remedy. Or pwede bang hindi i-enforce ang liquidated damage? Pwede rin kasi may alam tayo ng mga states na ayaw din ng liquidated damages. So what we are just trying to state here is that parties can avail of remedies when there is breach. Yan po importante. And we want to see that in the contracts of employment if ever they provide such. Next slide po, Attorney Nick. So, in relation to that, if there are problems, we provide on-site welfare services. So, mediation and conciliation, dito na tayo mag-concentrate. Kung may mga issues and concerns kayo with the employer, we can do mediation and conciliation. We can talk for you, we can write on your behalf, we can seek clarification on your behalf. In the same manner or conversely, pag may reklamo employer sa inyo, sa amin din dapat pumupunta eh. No, at magtatanong sila, oy may problema kami sa employee nito, pwede ba natin kausapin? So this provides the avenue, no, aside from the mechanism that you have already in the contract. Kasi nasa contract, meron din nakalagay, grievance machinery or grievance mechanism. Pag may galit kayo, doon yung isettle. But on top of that, our office provides for this service. Kung may gusto kayong itanong, gusto kayong ipatulong, or even questions, we can do that and we can entertain that. And we are available anytime. Although, of course, we have received some criticism and remarks that it takes a while for us to answer. We apologize po, but we do not provide an excuse actually and primarily, but we seek your indulgence kasi marami po talagang emails at maraming questions na dumarating sa amin on a daily basis, no? So, patong-patong po yan. Kaya sinasabi namin sa iba, please, if you need to write us, ilagay sa subject, urgent request for assistance. Kasi may iba po kasi na nagtatanong, saan pong office ninyo? Dear Polo, saan pong office ninyo? Eh, isang email na po yon. Or pangalawa, Dear Polo, paano ba sinusulat, paano ba kayo ma-reach sa ganito, ganito. So, dalawang email na yon. But the urgent requests should be entertained as urgently as possible and as soon as possible, and we ask you to do that. Put that in your title, no, in your subject, that this is something that is very urgent that needs immediate attention. So, next slide po, Sir Nick. Ngayon, let me just banggitin ko lang yung mga issues and concern, and I think you've already mentioned that contract substitution. We're not saying for the record that contract substitution is illegal. Ang gusto lang namin, doon sa panahon nagpa-accredit yung employer ninyo, may sinubmit na kontrata, and we expect that the same contract with those terms are the same contract that you will be signing. Minsan kasi nangyayari, may sinubmit sila na kontrata at pinaligaya nila kami. So natuwa naman kami at inapprove namin. Pero pagdating pala, ibang pinapirma sa nurse natin. No, so that is irregular from our end, and that is contract substitution. So we want, and we will flag, that's red flag for us, and we will call the employers out. Why they did not even bother to notify us if there are modifications or amendments along the way, or they substituted the contract that they submitted originally to us. So that's one. And you have the right to ask us, no, to even confirm whether the contract that you signed is the same contract that they submitted. Next slide. So yung form of contract, I think na-question na ito kanina ni Doc, no? Yung sinasabi niyang, kanina pala, yung ano yung job offer, letter of intent, okay to sa amin, it's not an issue as long as the 4 issues here or 4 items are addressed. Insurance, repatriation, termination clause, at free transportation. So pag ito nandito, okay na po sa amin yan. Next slide po.
Maganda po yung free transportation, attorney. Kasi ako noong time ko, I was hired 2008. We get free transportation. Pero yung mga recently yata, na mo problema kasi dumarating dito, walang kotse. If you live in Texas, you need a car because we don't have this subway system like New York.
Sir Paul, sorry, but I have to clarify. Free transportation would refer to in and out of the...
airfare. Yeah,
airfare. Sorry.
Yeah, okay. So not here.
Not here.
Okay.
But then, of course, that's a major issue right now, yung sinasabi nyo ngayon. But if there are questions later, we can address that. But free transportation here would refer to the first time of our nurses going out of the Philippines that should be shouldered by the employer. Next slide
Thank you
po,
po.
Sir Attorney Nick. Liquidated damage, ito na po yung kanina na pinag-uusapan natin ng todong-todo at bonggang-bongga. So, if there is a provision liquidated damage, hindi po natin inaalaw yan as a matter of policy. So, since 2020, inalista po natin yan. Okay. Next slide po. I think that's all. And I promised our contact details. And if you have questions, these are all our contact details, both in social media and our numbers that you can call us. Thank you, Attorney Nick.
Okay, so again, thank you very much then. That actually ends our presentation today. So it changed ano ko lang. So again guys, marami pang questions dito but I think we already had consumed almost 2 hours, 5 minutes short of. And I, in behalf of our guest, Labor Attache Attorney Trinidad, thank you very much, Dr. Paul, for joining us. And I hope we were able to actually answer the concerns of our nurses. And again, sinasabi natin kanina, if you have some concerns, the best agency that could actually help us out is the Polo office. Right? And I hope this is the beginning of our relationship in providing free legal education to our Filipino community, not only nurses, but all other professions as well, para magkaroon sila ng ample knowledge on what to do when they are actually found themselves in certain situations, right? So, as to wrap up our presentation today, Attorney Trinidad and Dr. Paul, would you like to say something? And again, thank you very much for joining me in this live.
I'll let Attorney Trinidad speak first.
Um,
Attorney.
Dr. Paul, thank you. Thank you for, and Attorney Nick, thank you for giving the Philippine government through Polo an avenue for which we could, provide relevant official information in relation to the issues that we raised right now. We hope to continue this conversation with the nurses. Please don't hesitate to ask questions with and anytime, and please give us also ample time to answer all those questions. We will try as much
Right.
can, as fast as we can to address all these issues. Yan po ang i-commit namin sa inyo, and we will also be facilitative for those employers who are listening and not prohibitive, but we will not hesitate not to enforce policies of the Philippine government in as far as protecting the rights and promoting the welfare of our workers are concerned, including our nurses. Maraming salamat po at magandang gabi sa inyong lahat.
Dr. Paul?
Thank you, Attorney Nick, for inviting me. Thank you, Attorney Trinidad. Thank you for all the information that you guys provided and for answering the questions of our nurses. I know sobrang dami pang questions. May mga nag-inbox pa sa akin, nagpo-post sa group. We'll probably try to create another show. I'll be inviting Attorney Nick. We have a show soon, right? Maybe we can also invite Attorney Trinidad to help us answer the questions. I know there's a lot of questions from nurses, but this is very educational. I've learned a lot myself. I didn't realize we've been on for 2 hours, but thank you po for, in behalf of the nursing community, salamat, Attorney Nick, for the free educational services that we did today, and for Attorney Trinidad for giving her time representing the Philippine government to clarify questions for us. Salamat po.
Maraming
And
salamat.
good night to everybody.
Good night. Okay. Stay ka muna, Paul, ha? Paul.
Yes, sir. Apa.
But